So there were sort of three main ideas I had in writing the book that sort of became the inspiration for the book. The first was that there's a lot of discussion about the geographic polarization of the country and how America is now divided into red states and blue states. But there hasn't been as much social science analysis of that question as you might think. There's a lot of popular punditry about what's going on in different parts of the country and why it is that states vote differently and how this current era is different from previous eras of American politics. But political scientists haven't paid as much attention to that question as people on CNN have. And in fact, some political scientists have even raised the question of whether a lot of this red state, blue state talk is sort of a media creation and it's an exaggeration compared to the reality of electoral patterns. So I thought it was worthy of investigation just to see how much we can substantiate using the tools of social science the proposition that the country is more divided geographically today than it has been before. And in general, there is a rise in geographic divisions as the book explains. The second sort of impetus for the book has to do with the discussion about polarization in American politics today that's happening among scholars as well as pundits and commentators. How much of the polarization that we see in our government reflects the polarization of the electorate? Some people think because they see a divided Congress, divided parties, that the country itself is equally divided and is just as polarized. Other people think that the average American is actually turned off by polarization and is disappointed at the lack of moderate options in the voting booth and the lack of bipartisanship in government. And so that in itself is an ongoing discussion among scholars about how much is polarization a phenomenon that's happening at the mass level as well as the elite level. And I wanted to investigate that question as well through the lens of the electoral system that we have, which is really important as an institution intermediating between the way that voters behave in the voting booth and the government that we actually get. And it's not necessarily a simple correspondence between what voters want and what government does, in part because we have this fairly complex set of rules and institutions in between the tabulation of votes and the filling of legislative seats and the presidency. And then the third point that I wanted to make in the book is that our current era in American politics is distinguished by some very close elections and two very evenly matched parties at the national level. And so even though the Democrats dominate in blue America in most elections and Republicans dominate in red America in most elections, when we get to the national balance of power between the parties, it sort of evens out, both in presidential and congressional elections. And so when we think about the ways in which our electoral system is important, one of the ways it's important is when you have really close elections, how exactly those votes are tabulated and exactly how you elect members of Congress and members of the Electoral College turns out to be really important for determining the winner, determining who holds political power. And we've seen that in several recent elections, both presidential and congressional elections, that the distribution of votes across geographic boundaries turns out to be absolutely central to the outcomes that we see. And because we have polarized parties, it really matters whether it's one party versus the other party that ultimately triumphs in that election. One of the main ways that our electoral system contributes to polarization is our use of winner-take-all elections. And we often take for granted or don't even think about the fact that we have a particular means of electing candidates in this country that's different from the way a lot of other democracies operate. But that has very significant implications for how our government works, as it turns out. And in terms of polarization, the fact that when you have a winner-take-all system, once a party gets 50% plus one of the vote, they win all the seats. They win, everything that's being elected, means that the differences that we see across regions in how voters vote get exaggerated when it comes time to filling seats in Congress. And so, for example, a typical blue state like Oregon or Illinois might only be about 55% Democratic, 45% Republican. And a red state like South Carolina or Arizona might be 55% Republican, 45% Democratic. But it really matters which party is the 55% and which is the 45%. And so a lot of the differences between the red states and blue states aren't that the voters in these states are voting dramatically differently. It's more that the electoral rules give a very strong advantage to which party happens to be the majority. And what we've seen over time has been that a lot of states that used to be 50-50 states and were therefore the swing states in presidential elections have migrated in one direction or the other to become 55% Democratic or 55% Republican, which is generally enough to mean that they're safe. And the candidates sort of write them off and don't even bother to compete or visit the states or run ads during a presidential election. And so the fact that we have these winner-take-all rules really exacerbates the regional polarization that we see. And it means that there are an awful lot of seats in Congress that are safe for one party or the other. And once you're the representative of a safe seat, you don't really have to worry too much about trying to be moderate or trying to reach out to the other party, because you only need to keep the people in your own party happy who vote in your party's primary. And so one thing that I hope the book accomplishes is to get people to think a little bit more than they usually do about the centrality of our electoral rules and electoral institutions in helping to propel the polarization that we see in Congress. One of the ways in which the rise of red states and blue states is tied to the polarization that we see in our government is that when we look at the sort of previous era of American history, where we had a lot of more moderate members of Congress elected, the vast majority of those ideological moderates were either moderate to even conservative Democrats who were elected from the South and from parts of the rural West, and on the other side, moderate to liberal Republicans who were elected from New England, other parts of the Northeast, and parts of the coastal West. And so what used to be the main geographic sources of our moderate politicians were these regional groups, these sort of regional factions within each party. And what has happened over time has been the places that used to elect moderate Democrats on a regular basis are today's red states, the southern states, the rural western states. And so rather than electing moderate Democrats in the same numbers that they used to, they're now overwhelmingly electing conservative Republicans. And then we see the opposite pattern in what are now the blue states, which used to be the places that supplied the moderate bloc of Republicans in Congress. Places like Vermont, Massachusetts, New York, California, Oregon. Now those are increasingly secure blue states, and they're electing liberal Democrats. And so when we think about how polarization has progressed in our government, a big part of the story is a geographic story. It has to do with the changing behavior of the American voters, who are increasingly not willing to vote for even moderate candidates if they have to cross party lines to do it. And as I show in the book, one of the main drivers of this geographic polarization is the rise of the culture war, of cultural politics, which really gets going in the 1990s. The parts of America that are the red states now are the most socially and culturally conservative parts, and the parts that are now the blue states are the more culturally liberal parts. And so once voters start voting on the cultural dimension of politics as well as the economic dimension, they become less willing to cross those party lines, and they are increasingly electing these more ideologically extreme, more party loyal candidates to Congress. And so once they get into Congress, they're not just voting differently on culture, they're voting differently on economics as well. And so it's not just polarization on the cultural dimension in Congress that we see, it's polarization on virtually every issue you can think of. We see Democrats and Republicans increasingly in two very separate camps, not able to agree, not able to compromise, with very little crossover, ideological crossover between the two parties in Congress. And so if we're trying to figure out why that is and what role do the American voters have in precipitating polarization at the elite level, we really have to pay a lot of attention to these changing regional patterns of party voting. If you look at a lot of the scholarly research on Congress from 30 or 40 years ago, one of the main findings at that time was that voters were increasingly voting for the personality of the candidate and not the party or the issues. And that if you wanted to run for Congress, the most important thing was to cultivate a positive personal reputation, and voters would be attracted to you as a candidate regardless of which party label you ran on. And what we've seen over that time since then has been a real shift in how voters treat the choice in the ballot box for their member of Congress. And today, they're much more party loyal than they used to be, and they're much more likely to vote on ideology or on especially cultural issues than they used to be. And so that means that the specific personality or the personal characteristics of the candidate doesn't mean as much, because increasingly voters look at their choice of who their member of Congress should be as a proxy vote for which party should control Congress as a whole. And one of the implications of that is that if you have a flawed candidate, a candidate who's gotten tripped up in a scandal, a candidate who's maybe not personally the most attractive candidate or the most popular or charming candidate, they can still get elected or reelected because voters decide, even if they don't really like this candidate personally, they'd still rather support the party rather than risk the other party gaining power. And we've seen some examples in recent congressional history of incumbent members of Congress who have gotten enmeshed in scandals that maybe in previous years would have sort of been disqualifying, would have led to their defeat. And they're able to kind of hold on and get reelected anyway because their voters are still willing to be party loyal and just won't take the step of voting for the other guys. We often treat the 2016 election as if it were this unique phenomenon in American history. And of course, there are ways in which it was unique. But it doesn't really stand out from other recent elections in terms of the geographic distribution of the party support across the United States. The red states stayed red, the blue states stayed blue, and the election was ultimately decided by the handful of states that are sort of in the purple category that do go back and forth between the parties, which is a small percentage of the total number of states. We also saw, of course, a discrepancy between the electoral vote and the popular vote, which just goes to show the centrality and essential importance of our electoral rules in determining how power gets distributed in our system of government. And so when we look at 2016 from the point of view of geography and the point of view of polarization, it doesn't look like much of an outlier compared to 2012, 2008, 2004, and 2000. It sort of follows the same pattern we've seen in other elections of a very close national election with very strong regional bastions of red and blue, and the Electoral College ultimately being pivotal in determining the final winner.